Quentin Miller. Quentin Miller is a kid that I was introduced to through Boy Wonder. Me and Boy Wonder were working on a project at the time. I had said to him, I want to do a mixtape. My nigga really need a. So we were working and he was like, yo, I got this kid. And you know, sometimes I send him beats and he just cooks up ideas. And he's like, yo, his ideas, they're good, you know? He's like, they need work, but they're good.
I ain't really fuck the pressure and the little wise confessions getting used. How money, you know how it goes.
You know how that should go.
Say it.
You don't have to explain. Say it though. You know how that should go.
Yeah, you know how that.
Say
and say it in that cadence. You know how that should go.
I just want to know if you ain't right there running through the six. Tell me who the f was quitting running through the six with her.
I study Quentin Miller
For a living.
Lobbies and Gentlegrams, it's a decade delayed from the Duck Stray sent Drake's way, which made the masked music maker behind bangers like 10 Bands never reach the potential he once had. A sad story of ghostwriting glory, peeling the plot back pertaining to the pen writing hot raps by Quentin Miller. But first, drop a like and subscribe to support the work put into making this thriller. Now, Lobbies and Gentlegrams, on July 22nd, 2015, Meek Mill opened the Pandora's box that would alter his legacy, Drake's legacy, an unknown Atlanta rapper's legacy, and shifted the paradigm within hip-hop as a whole for the rest of eternity. But really, this tweet would simply encapsulate a statement made from Drake himself just a few months earlier, on February 13th of 2015. And that would be a handwritten note posted to Drake's OVO website where he celebrated the release of his brand new mixtape. One of his best bodies of work that shifted his public perception from sad sobbing meme musician to a more aggressive force to be reckoned with within hip-hop. If you're reading this, it's too late. The barely readable thank you note for the mixtape said, "This tape would not be possible without Noel, Boy Wonder, Vinyls, 40, Oliver, CB, Cans, QM, Hush, Kenza, PND, and more." At the time, very few people cared to actually read this. Nowadays, artists don't even make thank you notes after they release an album because who even pays attention to them? Plus, a lot of the people Drake was thanking in this letter seemed obvious. He said this tape wouldn't be possible without Oliver, 40, Boy Wonder, Vinyls, P&D, etc. These were the names of producers or artists that were very close within Drake's camp. But QM, the 8th name on that list, that was a new name, an unfamiliar one. Who could it be? Well, back in February of 2015, before Meek Mill ever caught on, there were a small number of fans who carefully critiqued the credits commemorating the creators of this tracklist, and they discovered why Drake said this mixtape would not be possible without QM. If you're reading this, it's too late by Quentin Miller, interpreted by Drake. LOL, the real truth to this. This was tweeted out 4 days after Drake released the mixtape to the world. And it seemed like at that point, this was the only man in the world who knew Quentin Miller's name. That was, aside from the entire industry.
What a rapper, what a ghostwriter. Tell me what happened to you. I swore I wouldn't tell. I wouldn't tell. I wouldn't tell. I wouldn't tell. I wouldn't tell.
Before Meek Mill blew the whistle, ghostwriters were a common industry secret. It wasn't known by the fans, but the artists, the executives, everyone behind the scenes knew. And Quentin Miller was working with several heavy hitters behind the scenes for quite some time. No one knew he was rolling with Drake, let alone writing Drake's bars, but if you paid attention, the answers were there all along. Aside from Quentin Miller being credited as a writer on 4 of the 17 songs off of If You're Reading This It's Too Late's tracklist, aside from Drake saying the project wouldn't be possible without QM, aside from QM being in multiple Instagram pictures with Drake and different OVO members throughout all of 2015. Quentin was already becoming an established artist within the industry, working with several big players aside from Drake. But it was Drake who gave him the biggest opportunity yet with If You're Reading This. So how did Quentin Miller go from basically being an OVO artist, Drake saying the album wouldn't be possible without Quentin, to just 3 years later in 2018, Quentin saying he would never do anything with Drake again? And even worse, 2 years after that, on the 5th year anniversary of If You're Reading This It's Too Late, Quentin said it was the most stressful moment of his career.
everybody else is able to move on because everybody else's careers was established. My career wasn't established. And I was looking at that, if you're reading this moment, you know, at the time when I did it, I'm coming fresh off of 3 years ago. I was dropped as an artist. I'm working Publix, I'm working Target, I'm working factories and warehouses, I'm working, you know, different temp agency gigs. And then If You're Reading This came, and it's like, oh, shit, my life is about to change, you know. You know, it's just crazy how the best moment of my life, you know, after a tweet turned into like one of the most stressful moments of my life, you know. I envy all the other producers, artists, writers, whatever involved that get to just look at it in a good light, because it wasn't a good light for me. It was hell for me after that, you know.
So what happened when a local Atlanta artist got to work with the biggest pop rap artist in the world? And how did that end up almost destroying his career? From grinding great ghostwriting to grief and gloom, lobbies and gentlegrams, this is the story of Quentin Miller and how he survived OVO. Now, the biggest question that's still somewhat unanswered to this day is how the hell did the reference tracks actually leak? We know Meek Mill tweeted that Quentin Miller wrote the songs, but how did the actual songs of Quentin Miller rapping the Drake bars word for word make it to the world?
Funk Master Flex Night. Funk Master Flex. Funk Master. Funk Master Flex.
All money, new women, gotta keep it balanced.
The saddest part of the story is that it was only Quentin Miller who got screwed over by the entire situation. Drake went on to have a thriving career, same with Meek Mill, same with DJ Drama and Nicki Minaj. Hell, even DJ Akademiks basically had his big break by covering this beef.
It's your boy DJ Akademiks, and check it out, because you know what, man? Everybody has turned into a goddamn investigator. I mean, everybody's Matlock these days, right? Ever since the rumors or allegations from Meek Mill that Drake ain't writing his own shit. I mean, Drake fans are coming out saying, no, that can't be. Quentin Miller's not the writer, he's only credited, or he's credited, so that means he's not stealing, he's not a ghostwriter.
It was Quentin Miller who was left in the dust, and he was the only one throughout the entire situation who didn't do anything wrong. When the mixtape first came out, and Quentin Miller was in the club hearing songs like 10 Bands where Drake is rapping his lines word for word, and him being the only one in the club knowing that it was really him who recorded that song, he was never walking around telling people, you know, that's me, right? He was actually enjoying the moment, watching people rap along, thinking, you like those lyrics? You're talking like me now. Quentin knew he had a bigger mission. He was locked in with Drake. Fans loved the aggressive energy of If You're Reading This, It's Too Late, which all came from Quentin's pen, so there was no doubt Drake would continue working with him and strengthening their hit-making formula. And Quentin had aspirations of being a successful artist outside of the OVO sweatshop, flourishing on his own. But at the time, he was so unknown that it basically went completely under the radar that he was even credited as a writer on this Drake mixtape. So how did Drake even find this random local Atlanta artist? Quentin Miller came up as a homeschool kid from Metro Atlanta. He discovered his love for writing music early on when his parents enrolled him in the Masters Academy of Fine Arts. His introduction to hip-hop was through his older brother, who played him Protect Your Neck by Wu-Tang. And Quentin says, when my brother played me Protect Your Neck, really the whole album, I knew my future was going to be in music, in rap. At his church, he met a producer by the name of Sounds. Sounds' family attended the same church, and he later became known as BMW Kenny. He's the producer behind the viral TikTok hit Wipe It Down, and before that, he also produced Ray Shremmerd's hit Throw Some Mo. For a brief period of time, Sounds, who's now known as BMW Kenny, was even signed to Usher, and it was Sounds who first brought Quentin Miller into the music game. He would produce beats, and that allowed Quentin to be able to have instrumentals to rap over and create tracks of his own. But aside from just starting his rapping journey on Sounds' production, it was also Sounds who introduced him to Tricky Stewart. Tricky was a producer and executive who worked closely with the artist The Dream. In 1995, he founded his own record label called Red Zone Entertainment. He worked on some massive songs like Rihanna's Umbrella, Mariah Carey's Touch My Body, Justin Bieber's music, Chris Brown, and a lot more. And he was responsible for Quentin Miller's first big opportunity. It was around 2010 that Quentin Miller would sign a joint deal with Tricky's Red Zone Records, as well as Epic Records, which Tricky was the president of A&R at. And signing with Tricky was Quentin's first big break, giving him the motivation he needed to really make music a reality. Remember again, Tricky worked heavily with The Dream, and they were basically building a camp of other emerging R&B and pop artists. Quentin was the only rapper in that camp. And what's crazy is a young Frank Ocean was also in that same camp at the time, but back then he went by the name Lonnie Bro. Quentin was around him before he became Frank Ocean. Quentin has some crazy stories early on, like the Dream pulling up to the studio and inviting him to sit in the front seat of his Ferrari to quote-unquote feel what it's like. They even brought Quentin out to Vegas, where he watched the Dream work on Drake's 2010 song Fancy. And Quentin learned a lot about incorporating melody into his raps from the Dream. And you could hear that in his early music. Quentin had a pretty innovative sound from the beginning, taking inspiration from other fellow Atlanta up-and-comers like Future, but also sprinkling in the lyrical styles of an early Big Sean, Kanye West, and most definitely Drake. Like, when I play you some of his early music, you could easily hear Drake rapping these bars word for word.
Hit me on the phone, girl, hit me with a text. If you ain't drunk, then you need to get like me. Say that right, that right. Now homeschool niggas on the squad, yep. Hollywood chicken nuggets when it's dinner time. My apologies, it seems I'm being rude.
But although Quentin learned a lot about refining his artistry by being around legends like The Dream, it definitely came with a price, no pun intended. Because being an unknown artist, Quentin had no leverage when he signed a major label deal with heavyweights like The Dream and Tricky. And because of that, his contract was horrible. Quentin reflected on that time saying, back then, I was signed as an artist. I didn't know anything about publishing. I just thought, it's The Dream, he's on fire. And I'm with him and Tricky, so yeah, of course I'm signing. And this is going to play an important role very shortly. In the meantime, things are going pretty well for Quentin. Being in the studio with established industry vets like The Dream and Tricky allowed Quentin to be exposed to other massive producers and artists, even bigger than Frank Ocean at the time. And because he was standing next to heavyweights, it gave him some extra credibility that would incentivize these guys to give him a shot. In around 2013, Drake's right-hand producer Boy Wonder pulled up to a studio session with Tricky, and Quentin happened to be there. This will also play an important role in the story very shortly. Because first, things came crashing down harder than Quentin could have ever imagined. The way Quentin describes the next few years were absolutely brutal. He says, my deal with Tricky ended up getting transferred over to Epic Records, so technically I was signed to them, even though I wasn't listed on their website and hadn't met anyone from the label. In Atlanta, they just let me record. I thought they were developing me as an artist, helping me sharpen my craft, but really, they just had my publishing. I was putting in work, thinking it was for growth. Eventually, I went out to LA, and that's when things went left. An A&R from Epic, he's not there anymore, he pulled me out of a session I was in with Mike Will. I was literally in the middle of writing, phone in my hand, when he says, I just don't think you're a star. Even The Dream knows it. I cut him off like, can I just finish my session? He got offended like, oh, so you're kicking the head of A&R out? I'm like, you just told me I'm not a star in the middle of my session. Yeah, I need to work. Right after that, Tricky called him and says straight up, you're not Red Zone, you're not Epic, you're nothing, you're going back. They sent me back to Atlanta and made me wait there for 3 or 4 weeks just to get my car back. That hurt, man. I was young and that was a tough blow. They really thought I was done. Maybe not completely, they still had my publishing, but they weren't messing with me anymore. I had management at the time, but after everything, my manager wanted to wait and see if Tricky might work with me again. I knew I had to move on, so we parted ways. They really screwed me over. But they didn't drop my publishing, they kept it. It felt like I was a tagged animal, dropped from the roster but still owned. That broke me. I thought it was over. For about 3 years, I worked regular jobs, Target, Publix, whatever. And Drake even rapped about this on his diss track to Pusha T, Duppy Freestyle, but he made a mistake on which grocery store it was because he rapped, as for Q, man, I changed his life a couple times. The guy was at Kroger working double time, y'all acting like he made the boy when I was trying to help the guy. It's ironic that Quentin Miller was the reason behind Drake's first battle with Meek Mill, and on his second battle with Pusha T, he's rapping about Quentin Miller over a Boy Wonder beat. Why is that ironic? And how did Drake change the life of a young Atlanta artist who had just been dropped from their record label who was now bagging groceries? Well, remember how before Quentin Miller was dropped, he was working with Tricky in the studio and Boy Wonder came through for a session. Well, without much hope left, Quentin ended up sending a Hail Mary text to Boy Wonder, simply saying, yo, can I send you some songs? And like I mentioned earlier, because who Quentin Miller was standing next to years before, The Dream and Tricky, it gave him the validation he needed for Boy Wonder to actually say yes, send some music over. From there, the two formed a solid relationship. I mean, you could even see way back in the beginning of 2013, Boy Wonder was co-signing Quentin's music on Twitter. And at the same time, Quentin Miller also linked up with another Atlanta local artist by the name of Mac, and the two formed the group The Wedding Crashers. They would do some shows around Atlanta, and Quentin would bag groceries in the daytime, while also sending some of his solo music over to Boy Wonder in the meantime. Now, I don't know if you guys remember this time period, around 2013, but OVO was trying to develop the artist by the name of Obi. He has a few solid songs with Drake.
We call that scheming up.
And Obi was working heavily with Boy Wonder. So eventually Boy Wonder connected Quentin Miller with Obi and the two made some music together. That was how Quentin Miller first got his foot in the door at OVO. And Boy Wonder would continuously ask him to just send more music over until one day, something finally clicked.
10 bands, 50 bands, 100 bands.
One of the songs that Quentin had sent over was 10 bands. This was Quentin's solo song, but Boy Wonder loved it. And you know who loved it even more? Drake.
I study Quentin Miller for a living.
This was a life-changing moment for Quentin Miller. He recalled it saying, Boy Wonder messaged me back, yo, Drake is effing with 10 bands. He's going crazy over it. I assumed Drake was going to get on the track, like he had done for other artists. Back then, he was hopping on younger artists' records, like Migos Versace, Fetty Wap's My Way, I Love McConaughey's Tuesday, and a lot more. I thought I was about to have a record with Drake, be on a song with him, and take off. But the problem was, because Quentin thought this would be his song that Drake would simply hop on as a feature, he ended up playing the song for a couple of his friends, thinking that this would be the song that helped him get his big break. Quentin said, I'm like, oh crap, I had sent 10 bands to a couple friends. I didn't know what a reference track was at the time. I just thought I was making a record. Remember, Quentin thought Boy Wonder meant Drake just loved the song and he was ready to throw a verse on it, not re-rap the whole thing and keep it for himself. And that's why when we eventually heard the reference track, Drake's version was basically the exact same as Quentin's. Quentin emphasized, the 10 bands leak was basically exactly what I had recorded. Same hook, same verse. I thought it was going to be a collab, but instead, it became something else. I kept sending more ideas to Drake, more tracks. Next thing I know, I'm getting flown out. Now at this point, we're probably in late 2014. Quentin is basically a member of OVO. He said he was walking around rocking the OVO jackets, merch, he's in the studio with them every day, and that's around the time you start seeing Quentin Miller pop up in different Instagram pictures with OVO members. Quentin even ends up working with Drake and Big Sean on the song Blessings. That's probably why Drake's part on that song sounded so similar to his work on the If You're Reading This It's Too Late mixtape. It was all based off Quentin Miller's blueprint. And as Drake described it years later, Boy Wonder introduced him to Quentin as a guy who had some good ideas that just needed a little work.
Quentin Miller is a kid that I was introduced to through Boy Wonder. Me and Boy Wonder were working on a project at the time, and he was like, yo, I got this kid. Sometimes I send him beats and he just cooks up ideas, and he's like, yo, his ideas, they aren't that good, you know? He's like, they need work, but they're good. So yeah, at the time, I was like, all right, dope, let's collaborate, let's line it up.
From there, Drake and Quentin Miller would quote-unquote work on a bunch of other music. All this for a mixtape that Drake was in the process of producing. Remember, before If You're Reading This Is Too Late came out, he had already announced that his next album would be Views from the Six. So the vision for If You're Reading This was just get a tape out of raw, darker, unpolished bangers, and it was really Quentin Miller who was the pillar of building that sound. You can hear it in all of the songs off that tape. It had that Atlanta trap influence that Drake would go on to use forever, and that all came off the strength of Quentin Miller's hooks and melodies. Quentin would go on to say that Drake told him that without Quentin Miller, they couldn't finish that project. But Drake would describe it as two artists simply collaborating back and forth.
I have no embarrassment when it comes to what I did on that album. You know, I mean, I worked with somebody on, I think, 4 or 5 songs on that record. I pulled my weight when it came to my pen. It wasn't like I needed somebody to facilitate, you know, entire ideas. We worked together.
What's interesting though is, as Quentin describes it, the only song him and Drake actually worked on where it was a back and forth type thing, like Drake writing a couple bars, then Quentin writing a few, the only song they cooked up with that type of process was the song No Telling, which Quentin isn't even credited as a writer on the tracklist of If You're Reading This Is Too Late. But the rest of the songs that Quentin has writing credits on, they were all demos that Quentin recorded himself. And then Drake would go in, change a couple bars, and use Quentin's version as basically a skeleton or a blueprint. We saw that on Blessings, Used To, Legend, 6 Man. No Telling was the only one they actually worked on in the studio together. And then you get Rico. We'll get to that shortly, because that was the song that destroyed Drake and Quentin Miller's entire relationship. But again, it was actually the 10 Bands reference track that started circulating first. The world just hadn't heard it until Meek Mill exposed the entire thing. but Quentin was the one who sent it around. Before being flown out to work with Drake directly, that was the song that he sent to Boy Wonder and the first song that he thought Drake would hop on as a feature. So because of that, he sent his version out to a couple friends. Now at the time, remember, Quentin Miller was also working with Mac as the Wedding Crashers duo. They dropped some songs on SoundCloud and caught the attention of Don Cannon and DJ Drama, who were forming their own record label, Generation Now. They had also just signed Lil Uzi Vert around this time in 2015. Ironically, Quentin Miller released his first Wedding Crashers mixtape, UTD Infinity, about 2 days after Drake released If You're Reading This Is Too Late, on February 14th, 2015. I emphasize this to say, you would have never known that these two artists knew each other. So Quentin's working with DJ Drama under his duo The Wedding Crashers, and at the same time, he's working as a solo writer with Drake on If You're Reading This. But now, If You're Reading This already dropped. Quentin played a huge role in the project, so what was his future at OVO gonna be? That tape was a huge success for Drake, allowing him to build the forming foundation of his phony Montana mob boss persona through aggressive tracks that Quentin helped pen. But as you probably know, this is when Drake started leaning in a more pop direction. Shortly after this, we would see him release songs like Hotline Bling and One Dance, so maybe he was done with Quentin's more rap-centered Atlanta sound that we heard on songs like Energy and 10 Bands. Now we're in the spring of 2015. And Quentin says, I'm going out to LA, working with Drake more. I play him some Wedding Crashers songs, nothing happens. Played him some Quentin Miller solo songs, nothing happened. Meanwhile, DJ Drama and Cannon are still effing with us heavy in Atlanta. So when I come back home, that's where my focus went. This had me in a state of euphoria. I had been dropped from my record label, I thought it was over, and now I'm working with the biggest artists in the world, while also having DJ Drama and Don Cannon supporting my group. The city was rocking with us, our shows were turning up. When I was in LA, we were definitely focused on making Drake's If You're Reading This album. So once that album comes out, I'm now in a studio in Atlanta that Drake's camp had booked for me to record and send over ideas. At this point, Drake's not taking anything. I'm sending stuff, nothing is landing. So I'm using the time to make songs for myself too. I make this one idea, Rico, and I figure he's not going to take this either. And how my days worked is after I would go to the session that Drake booked for me, I would then swing by DJ Drama's studio. Me and Drama were tight back then, always talking music, texting ideas, so I also sent Drama the Rico song like, hey man, here's something I made. He was effing with it. A week later, Drama says, yo, you know that song? Meek Mill got on it. I'm like, for real? I didn't even know Drake had taken the record. And now this is where things get tricky. No pun intended, since remember, Tricky was the guy that still owned all of Quentin's publishing. If someone owns an artist's publishing, it means that they control the rights to the artist's songwriting, including the lyrics, melodies, and compositions, and they collect a share, or all, of the royalties earned from those songs. So basically, because Quentin Miller signed that horrible contract to Tricky years before this, the only way he was able to make money off his music was collecting money under the table. If he was credited as a writer, the money from the songs he was credited on would go to Tricky since he owned Quentin's publishing. So this is probably why there were a few Drake songs that Quentin wrote that he wasn't even credited on, like No Telling, because he was getting paid under the table. And ultimately, all of the Drake songs that Quentin helped write, he only got $30,000 in total up front, without getting a single royalty check in the future for all the work that he did. And I think this is one of the worst parts of this entire story. Not only did this massive moment end up backfiring on Quentin, but he wasn't even able to properly profit off it because of his horrible label situation. But he was still rocking with Drake, so at the time things are all good, right? Well, months after Drake rejecting music, they struck gold again with Rico. Drake liked it and changed up Quentin's reference track to slightly modify it into his own. And it's so crazy to me to this day because I would grow up listening to these songs, right? Thinking like Drake had found a perfect formula for writing bangers compared to his earlier music that was a lot more soft, right? In reality, all of these songs were just Quentin recording stuff, hoping that Drake would bite on something. And Drake would only record over Quentin's vocals, never actually giving him a feature of his own or a front stage look. It's eerie even hearing Quentin's reference tracks, like on Rico, where he rapped, "Oh be my brother, me and him go way back." Oh be my brother, me and him go way back, second penny days. It sounds like these are really bars that Drake would write himself, right? Because it is about Drake's artist, Obi. But it does make sense that this was really Quentin writing a vague song that could be in his perspective or Drake's, because Quentin had also worked with Obi. So was Quentin concocting songs like Rico thinking that they were going to be published to the world as his own work or Drake's? It was all kind of effed up. But once Meek Mill heard Rico, that's where things really got effed up. Remember, there's a bar on there, The girl of your dreams to me is probably not a challenge.
Girl of your dreams to me is probably not a challenge.
At the time, Meek Mill is dating Nicki Minaj, so when he hears Drake rap these bars on his own song, he's furious. Drake and Nicki Minaj had, at the very least, a very flirty relationship in the past. And for the reason we'll touch on shortly in this video, Meek Mill felt like Drake was taking shots at him with that bar. But DJ Drama, having worked with Quentin at the time and hearing that song before it even got into Drake's hands, he knew it was Quentin who wrote that bar, not even Drake. So he told Meek Mill, look, you have nothing to worry about. Drake is not sending shots at you. He didn't even write that song.
With the line, to me, your girl of your dreams is really not a challenge or whatever.
Right.
So, bro, he's not dissing you. He's not dissing you. Like, he's not dissing you.
He's talking about someone else, talking about just inferior.
But those weren't technically his bars.
Oh, got it. Yep. Okay.
You know, I had a conversation with my man about something, you know, and from there it just blew out of proportion.
So now Meek Mill knows who Quentin Miller is and knows that he writes for Drake. And according to Quentin, around the time that Rico drops, DJ Drama comes to him like, hey, Meek Mill wants you to start writing for him, a hook or something. Quentin says, I said no, I'm with Drake. I got the OVO goose on. Y'all haven't seen me with a Dream Chasers hat. Why would I switch up? At that time, I hadn't even met Meek, and the energy just didn't feel right to me. Later, I'm at DJ Drama's studio, and he's standing there with Meek Mill and Nicki Minaj. They're like, yeah, that's the guy. DJ Drama plays them one of my songs, the most Drake-sounding song that I had, and even takes off Mac's verse. Remember, Mac, again, is the other guy in their Wedding Crashers group. Meek and Nicki were into the song, but they're acting stuck up in the studio. Then Nicki says, I need the room, and everyone leaves. A few days later, I'm approached again. Meek's on the other side of the building, and I hear, Meek's got some racks for you. They came to me again like, yo, Meek's got cash for you, so you don't have to tell Tricky since he owes your publishing, you'll just get this money under the table. And I'm like, nah, man. So at this point, I turned down to write for Meek Mill twice. First time was no money, second time he offered cash, and I still said no. He knew I turned him down before. And that second time, I left the studio and got a call from DJ Drama, and he's furious. How are you not going to do these ideas for me? I'm just like, I don't need to do that. It turned into a whole thing. I remember hitting Drake like, yo, this is kind of weird, and explaining the whole situation. So when everything later blew up publicly, it wasn't like we were 100% blindsided. There was already some weird stuff going on. So remember that because it's important. Meek Mill hears Rico, he thinks Drake is taking shots at him, later finds out it was this guy by the name of Quentin Miller who actually wrote the verse. Then Meek approaches Quentin several times to write for him. Quentin says no, and things get weird. This is where it all blew up. So if you've kept up with both Nicki Minaj and Meek Mill's career, you know how loud and crazy they could be on Twitter. Always giving their unfiltered opinion, 90% of the time it's unwarranted and highly destructive. Well, the days leading up to the big blow of Quentin's cover, Meek Mill was on an absolute tweeting spree. First, he started off beefing with Nicki Minaj's ex-boyfriend Safari, and that directly led into it becoming Drake and Quentin's turn to feel Meek Mill's wrath on Twitter. We'll get to that shortly, because we have to answer a couple important questions within this video. Aside from the question of how did the reference tracks actually leak out of Drake's possession, another question that was never truly answered was what caused Meek Mill to turn the Twitter fingers onto the Toronto tough-talking Tweety Bird in the first place? We're going to answer both these questions in this video. So the question of why did Meek Mill end up exposing Drake on Twitter? What caused that? Well, Meek Mill originally would say it was because he had a show that Drake was supposed to make an appearance at, and he had his management team text Meek Mill at the last minute saying that he wouldn't end up making it. And we'll touch on that later because that was Drake's excuse as well. But you can't really rely on the people who were directly involved in this situation who want to save their image to give you the full truth. It's in Drake's and Meek Mill's best interest to make the situation seem as clean and clear as possible. But you could rely on the people who were around at the time, who have no incentive to not make things messy, to give you the actual truth behind the story. And Akademiks, who, like I mentioned before, got his big break off of covering this beef, he found out years later that it actually started because of an argument that Nicki Minaj and Meek Mill had, where Nicki mentioned Drake. Remember, a year before Meek Mill started dating Nicki, and this was all going down, Drake and Nicki were very intimate together. There was the Anaconda music video where Nicki was giving Drake a lap dance. She did the same thing at a live show. There was that time they were performing together where Drake picked her up. It was flirtatious to say the least, but now she's dating Meek Mill. Meek Mill releases his album Dreams Worth More Than Money on June 29th, 2015. That's where the song Rico is on. The bar in question that had Meek Mill tripping, allegedly, is, of course, the girl of your dreams to me is probably not a challenge. That's the bar that Drake rapped that Quentin wrote. Meek Mill had made it obvious that he was now with the girl of his dreams, Nicki Minaj. But beyond that, Meek Mill's whole brand was about dreams. Dream Chasers, the label, and his mixtape series, the Dreams vs. Nightmares album intro, the new album that was called Dreams Worth More Than Money. Drake was rapping about the girl of your dreams is probably not a challenge. Definitely on the surface, this seems like a reference to Meek Mill, especially when we look at how Drake and Nicki were acting just a year before this. And years later, we would get some info from DJ Big Macus and Akademiks, who kind of put the pieces together on what exactly happened. And he claims that the source he heard this from, if we knew who that source was, we would for sure know that this wasn't just a rumor. This is really what happened. And the dates line up. So Meek Mill, after he releases his album, he goes on tour with Nicki Minaj in the summer of 2015. On July 20th, 2015, they have a show in Miami. That'll play an important role shortly. According to Akademiks, it was when Meek and Nicki were in Miami, a day before or after this show that they had, where they end up shopping at this store. Meek Mill didn't have enough cash to pay for both his and Nicki's clothes, so he asked Nicki for money. Apparently, Nicki ends up flipping out, saying that if this was Drake, he would never make her pay for her own stuff.
Meek, Nicki in a store. Meek had like, I don't know, $40,000 or $80,000 in cash on him. Him and Nicki go get a bunch of go to the cash register. He don't have enough money to cover what it is. It's not that Meek don't have the money. He only had cash. Nicki gets upset, pays for her stuff alone, and leaves. And while she's leaving, he said, yo, Nicki, could you pay this? I'm going to pay you back. And Nicki, she said, I guarantee Drake wouldn't let me do that.
And a couple years after Akademiks had said this, one of Meek Mill's Dream Chasers artists or affiliates, I'm not even sure what to call this guy, he goes by the name of Adin, he kind of corroborated this story. He said that Nicki and Meek Mill had gone to a fight in Miami. Dean was right there with him, seeing this all go down. And as they're riding on bikes back to their hotel, Meek Mill is going crazy on his phone, Twitter fingers and Instagram fingers in full effect. And this is where we get the long-standing rant that included Meek Mill exposing Drake for ghostwriters.
We wound up shopping down there. This dude get to arguing with this girl in his mall, in his store because she told that I ain't paying your tag. Go get your money out the hotel. He said, I just got $2,000 on me. Like I can't borrow $6,000 or whatever many $1,000s it is. They arguing real bad. They get to calling each other all kinds of crazy names. This corny dude starts spitting on. I said, yo, you crazy and shit. I told him right then and there, you lost your mind. Nut. Arguing what? We get on the bikes. Long story short, I'm gonna cut this short because I ain't gonna say too much. This nut riding down the street, me, him, and Coon. I'm still Willie. I'm riding. I ain't thinking nothing of it. This on Instagram writing the longest message.
And you might be saying, these are all rumors, right? But when you look at what was really going down back then, all of this stuff makes sense. So again, Meek Mill gets insecure about that specific bar, The Girl Your Dreams is not a challenge. DJ Drama quickly lets him know it wasn't even Drake that wrote the bar. Then, about a month later, he's arguing with Nicki Minaj in a store in Miami. She allegedly brings up how Drake would never make her pay for her own things, and that's where we see Meek Mill go off on Twitter about Drake. And it's interesting, when you go back to articles that were released around the time, no one exactly knew what set Meek Mill off, right? That was the question everyone had. Like, why would he randomly just attack Drake on Twitter in such a random, aggressive way, especially calling out something as drastic as Drake using ghostwriters? That would have been career-shattering if Drake didn't play his cards right. And an article from Vibe way back then was speculating on why this could have happened. And one of their theories was, like we now know, Meek Mill and Nicki were in a fight, which prompted Meek Mill to go off on Twitter. Not just at Drake, but also at Meek Mill's ex-boyfriend, Safari. And in this Vibe article, this was published in July of 2015, they said, there is a reason to believe Meek Mill and Nicki's relationship is on the rocks, as video footage from Nicki and Meek's Miami performance on July 20th displays them interacting awkwardly on stage and barely looking at each other. In Meek Mill's storm of tweets, he said, when Drake rapped the Dream Girl stuff on Rico, I thought he was coming at me, LOL. And when you look at footage from their concert that night in Miami on July 20th, you could see that they looked a lot more awkward or hostile than they did during other show appearances. Usually they're like kissing each other on stage, hugging, doing the collaborations that they have with their arms wrapped around each other and all that. But in the Miami footage, the very blurry footage that we have, you could kind of see like they're not really interacting with each other in a very lovey-dovey way. It almost seems like a couple who had just gotten a fight and who has to put their differences aside just to make the show go on.
Miami, that's
I go by the name of Meek Millie. We right here on the Pink Print Tour. If you from Miami, sing this.
And remember, it was in Miami, right after this performance, where allegedly Meek Mill and Nicki Minaj did get in the fight that led Meek Mill to get on Twitter to attack Drake. Now, it's weird because a couple days before this, Meek Mill and Nicki had a show in Houston for the Pink Print Tour, and Meek Mill posted a picture where he's standing alongside J Prince and J Prince Jr. These are the guys that usher Drake into the game. Why would he be standing right next to these guys 3 days before going on an onslaught that could have potentially destroyed their artist Drake's entire career? Could it have really all been over the fact that Drake didn't show up to Meek Mill's show? Well, that's according to Meek. According to Drake, 2 years later in a 2017 interview, he had said that due to some issues that Meek Mill had with Nicki, he decided to concoct a narrative that Drake doesn't write his own raps.
Meek Mill, due to some issue with Nicki, whatever it was, decided to create a narrative that I don't write my own music because that was what was convenient for him at the time, and he caught wind of it.
And so we'd see this spiral out on the evening of July 21st, 2015. Like I mentioned before, he started it off by going at Nicki's ex-boyfriend Safari Samuels, saying stuff like, "I'm not with all this fake happy stuff and keep my name out of it before I make a scene. This guy SB, aka Safari Samuels, was twerking, man. I always thought you were gay letting your girl do all that stuff." Then it trickled on to Drake. Meek starts the rant saying, "Dweebs, LOL. People so fake you can blow their cover in 2 days. Stop comparing me to Drake too. He don't write his own raps. That's why he ain't tweet my album, because we found out." Again, remember, it was when Meek Mill first heard Rico that he freaked out about that one bar, and someone had to tell him, allegedly DJ Drama, that, hey, it wasn't actually Drake who wrote the bar. So Meek Mill had been known before this tweet about Quentin Miller. He just decided this was the right time to expose it, emphasizing that that's why Drake didn't tweet out his album or show up to his show, because Meek Mill had found out he uses ghostwriters. And Meek Mill would continue. Other artists know though. Lil Wayne and Nicki, they know. Ask them. They're gonna act like they didn't see these tweets. The whole game know for real. They're scared to tell the truth. I can't wait to K these guys and sit back and act like they don't know. Don't compare me to none of the cats that don't write their own raps either. LOL. Kendrick and J. Cole, they really know how to rap, even though they're in different lanes. Dude is all the way out of it. He didn't even write that verse on my album, and if I would've knew, I would've took it off my album. I don't trick my fans. LOL. I only know how to tell the truth. If Jay-Z gave me a verse that somebody else wrote, I would do the same. No shade to Jay. And amidst this, I still find it hilarious to this day. Rick Ross, amidst the chaos, had tweeted and then very quickly deleted, "Drake, way greater than Meek Mill." And just like that, like Meek Mill had said in the tweet, he blew Drake's cover right then and there. But who this would really affect more was Meek Mill himself, and of course Quentin Miller. At the time though, we still don't know who Quentin Miller is, right? Meek Mill just said Drake doesn't write his raps. He didn't say who was writing his raps. Well, quickly after those tweets, OG Mako, who had been affiliated with Quentin Miller at the time, both of them coming up in the SoundCloud era within Atlanta, in the same era, he tweeted out saying, "Thanks for finally telling them, Meek Mill. Now maybe Quentin Miller will get the credit he deserves for all those hits." And then about an hour or two later, Meek Mill tweets him out by name. Quentin Miller. And he kept going. This lasted for days. He continued, "When he said the Dream Girl stuff on Rico, I thought he was coming at me, LOL. Then Young Bull played me the verse in his voice before my album came out, and I was mad as hell." AKA, like Quentin had said, he had been in the studio with DJ Drama, Meek Mill, and Nicki Minaj, and I'm assuming this is when Meek Mill is referencing the fact that Quentin had played his own version of Rico so Meek Mill could see it wasn't Drake who wrote that bar. Meek would continue with the Twitter rants. "If we found out Jay-Z didn't write his own raps, that's okay. I would really probably cry." Then he goes back attacking Nicki's ex-boyfriend again, Safari, saying, "I'm not off Safari twerking yet though. And let's get it clear, Nicki or nobody not responsible for my success. I've been had the culture with me. Don't ever get that confused. I was supposed to do 200K first week last time, and when I did 165, they were acting like I failed, LOL. One fan tweeted out the picture of Nicki Minaj giving Drake a lap dance saying, "Enough said," and Meek Mill responded saying, "I asked her about how she did that with a boyfriend that was before me, LOL. As long as I'm claiming you, no lap dances, no rice, no nothing for any rappers. And this whole time too, Nicki is going back and forth with Safari on Twitter as well while she's dating Meek Mill. Just to show you guys, like, nothing has changed from 2015 to 2025 with Meek Mill and Nicki Minaj. They're still going crazy on Twitter today. So now the world has more questions than answers. Why does Meek hate Drake? Why is Meek exposing Drake for having ghostwriters? Who is this ghostwriter? What did Quentin Miller actually do? Did he really write for Drake? Like, we don't even know who this guy is yet. Well, not for long. Less than 24 hours after Meek Mill would go through this whole attack on Twitter, Funk Flex would tweet out, "I got the ghostwriter, how much he's making and what songs he wrote. Tonight, 7 p.m. And that night, he goes live on air and premieres the first reference track by Quentin Miller, 10 Bands. And remember earlier in the story, this was the first song that Quentin sent over to Boy Wonder that Drake actually loved and wanted to collaborate on. But what Quentin thought was collaboration was really coercion into basically just stealing the record for himself. But Quentin, thinking that Drake is about to hop on this record, he's playing it for some friends. So it ends up circulating. So the question of how 10 Bands and why that was the first reference track that leaked ended up getting into the hands of Funk Flex is likely because Quentin Miller was going around showing it to people, his friends, thinking that this was about to be the big hit that takes his career to the next level, not knowing yet that Drake would just take that song for himself. Now, Meek Mill would continue on the Pink Print tour with Nicki Minaj, doing a bunch of shows. They would seem to get over their differences together, and at a show on July 23rd, just about a day and a half after all these tweets, Meek Mill would actually be on stage apologizing to not just Nicki Minaj, but also Drake for going at him.
I've been around Nicki Minaj. I heard niggas say they write Nicki Minaj shit. That's very not true. Make some noise for a young queen going up there. And don't get it twisted. I was just upset as a fan that a nigga gave me a verse name right. Shout out to Drake, let him be great in all the motherfucking lanes he great in. But I'm gonna still be the realest man in this.
So it's pretty obvious at this point, right? Like, whatever excuse they want to make, people who were in Meek Mill's camp right next to him when him and Nicki were fighting have pretty much confirmed that this started over an argument that they had in a shop in Miami. Meek is mad that Nicki brought up Drake, and so as a result he gets on Twitter and starts beefing with Nicki's ex-boyfriend Safari and randomly calling out Drake, and Quentin Miller just catching strays in the crossfire. And just 2 days later, Meek Mill is trying to walk it back and apologize to Drake, but now it's blown up far beyond anybody's control. Funk Flex has the reference tracks. Hip-hop is shaken up. We've never seen reference tracks like this leak in this capacity, especially from someone we thought was writing all their own bars. Well, about a day later on July 24th, 2015, Quentin would get online and try to kind of clear the air on what exactly was going down between his working relationship with Drake. So he said, "Winter 2014, I was just another guy working a job he hated with a passion for music, and somehow found myself on the phone with one of my idols. I told him I worked in a bakery, and his exact words were, 'F that, you're destined for greatness.'" Hearing that from someone I had been studying since 2009, bar for bar, there's no ways to describe that. Most of the If You're Reading This project was done before I came in the picture. I remember him playing it for me for the first time thinking, why am I here? Like, what does he need me for? The answer is nothing. I watched this man piece together words in front of me. I watched him write/replace bars 2 to 3 at a time on 6 p.m. in New York. I witnessed him light up, go in, and freestyle Madonna. I took notes from the best in the game. I remember him showing me thank you notes in New York before the album dropped, showing me the QM, showing me they put me on the credits of the project. Again, remember I showed this to you guys earlier, the thank you note where Drake says thank you QM, or this project wouldn't be possible without QM. Quentin Miller is referencing that here. Drake attached my name to something that touched the world. When nobody would pay attention, Drake saw something in me and reached out. Of all people, Drizzy. Two artists in exact opposite spaces in their career. We came together and made something special. I am not and never will be a ghostwriter for Drake. I'm proud to say that we've collaborated, but I can never take credit for anything other than the few songs that we worked on together. That's all I have to say on this. Back on my 13-17 stuff. QM. Now this was back then in 2015, right? But years later, Quentin Miller would clear the air on what exactly the conversations were like between him and Drake when Meek Mill had tweeted out Quentin's name, along with the fact that he was writing for Drake. Of course, Drake at this time is on full-on damage control. not only does he have to try and make the world believe that he didn't have a ghostwriter, but he also simultaneously has to be prepared in case Meek Mill comes with a full-fledged diss track against him. He's got to be ready with another one of his own. So when Quentin looks back on this time, he emphasizes the fact that Drake was really flustered here, right? And was basically just trying to make sure the world knew that it wasn't some random local rapper in Atlanta writing all of his bars. So Quentin had said, "Mine and Drake's relationship, after that it just felt weird. I felt like there was resentment towards me. When everything was happening, when Meek Mill tweeted my name out, he hit me and said, 'Yo, they're trying to give you credit for songs that I worked hours on.' I told him, I don't want that. I'm good with credit for the songs I actually did. I looked up to you before I got here." When things started going crazy, it was all just panic. I was like, should I say something? Okay, I'll say something to the world. And then after I said something, there was less talking between me and Drake. I never even had a full conversation with him after everything happened. I didn't get to say like, yo, I didn't think you were going to get on the 10 Bands record, and that's the only reason why I ever played it for someone. That conversation was never even an option. Because remember, as we now know, it's likely because Quentin had been playing 10 Bands for some of his friends, people around him, thinking that Drake maybe would have hopped on a feature, but not actually taken the song for himself, that reference track had even leaked in the first place. And now you might be wondering, well, what does Meek Mill think of all this, right? Meek Mill had been in the studio with Quentin Miller. He had asked him to write for him. Quentin had said no, and now Quentin's going online saying what Meek Mill said is not true. I wasn't actually Drake's ghostwriter. Meek Mill probably looks at Quentin a little bit funny, right? Like, I'm over here trying to give you the credit for songs that you wrote for Drake. Meanwhile, you're basically telling the world I'm a liar. So again, Quentin is just caught in the crossfires. But this thing with Meek Mill, that's going to play an important role very shortly. But first, we get a response from Drake. So about a day after Quentin goes online and says, you know, I wasn't Drake's ghostwriter, never have been, we just worked together on some songs, Drake, on Saturday, July 25th, on his OVO radio show, premieres 3 songs. Right Hand, Hotline Bling, which was originally labeled a Cha-Cha remix, and his first diss track aimed at Meek Mill, Charged Up. Now, Charged Up has some interesting bars on it that we're going to look at later in this video, but at the time, people kind of brushed this song off, right? It was very soft, calm. It was the calm before the storm, most literally, but Meek Mill didn't know that yet. So he gets back on Twitter, calling the song Baby Lotion Soft, saying that I could tell that Drake actually wrote that one, though. And remember, about 3 days before this, Meek Mill was on Nicki Minaj's tour apologizing to Drake, saying that, you know, this was a misunderstanding. They could both be great in their own separate lanes. But now Drake had kicked this whole thing off, right? Funk Flex was premiering Quentin reference tracks on the radio, saying that he also had a Meek Mill diss, but no Meek Mill diss had came out. But Meek did not hesitate to start dissing Drake on stage during one of Nicki's shows. July 26th at the Barclays Center, he gets on stage talking about this new Drake diss track, saying that, again, it's Baby Lotion Soft. Tupac and Biggie had to die over their beef, so if you're going to be the greatest in this thing, you got to make sure that your pen game is strong. He also cleared the air on what exactly happened with the whole Rico verse and how he heard the reference track.
But he gave me a verse that he didn't write that another nigga wrote. Where I come from, I represent the motherfucking game. I represent the motherfucking streets. If you ain't with me, you ain't got to act like you with me. I got the motherfucking streets with me for life. If you came up from nothing and you chasing your motherfucking dreams, make some noise in this. I was on Instagram, I was on Twitter or something yesterday, and they said, go ahead, nigga, fired off on you. I heard that shit was very soft. Baby Lotion Soft. We ain't gonna focus too much motherfucking energy on that. But I'm gonna let you know, when it comes to this rap shit, Biggie and Tupac had to die to be the motherfucking greatest. If you gonna be the motherfucking greatest in this shit, just make sure you doing your motherfucking pen game and keep it all the way above 100. Cause it's levels to the shit.
And at the time, this is pretty lit, right? Meek Mill is talking his crap and it transitions into this dark banger that he has with the song Levels. Like, he seems still not necessarily calculated with what he's doing, but at least there's like this raw, passionate energy to him. Like, if you're going to be the greatest, make sure your pen is working properly. He's talking a lot of crap on Twitter and at shows. It makes you think that he's about to come with something crazy. He just dropped the bomb on Twitter. There's no doubt, and he's a battle rapper too from Philly. There's no doubt he's coming with something crazy, a nuke. But what Drake did was smart, was the fact that just like Kendrick did when he sent his first shot at Drake while Drake was still on tour, Meek Mill was very busy in love with the woman that he's touring with, right? talking all this crap on Twitter and shows, but doesn't look like he has enough time to actually hit a studio. Because even though we're getting rumblings from Funkmaster Flex or whoever that Meek Mill is about to drop a diss track, we don't hear nothing until the night of July 28th, 2015, when Drake drops one of the biggest diss tracks of all time, back to back. I gotta give it to Labrie here. This is a genius chess move, right? Make the Ghostwriter get online and say that everything Meek Mill said online was complete cap, then drop a slew of hits back to back and 2 diss tracks back to back to make the world know that even if it's not your pen concocting this stuff, you are a great hit maker. Think about it, right? In the span of 4 days after getting called out for not writing his own rhymes, he gives us not just Charged Up, not just back to back, but also Hotline Bling, his biggest hit up to that date. And all the while, all of this stemming from Meek Mill being in his feelings while on tour with his girlfriend, arguing with her ex-boyfriend on Twitter, apologizing on stage, and then talking crap on stage the next day to Drake. Drake encapsulated that whole thing with one bar. Is that a world tour or your girl's tour? Trigger fingers turned to Twitter fingers. I mean, these lines were very simple and quotable, but they did carry some depth to them because Meek Mill was acting like a massive crybaby, not just on Twitter, but also on his girl's tour. And about 2 days after this, Meek Mill would finally release his diss track. This is July 30th. More than 7 days after he revealed to the world that Drake used ghostwriters, and enough time had passed for Drake to already release 2 diss tracks against him, and one that was so big, it was too big to beat or ignore. So we get Wanna Know from Meek Mill, where he raps bars like, tell me if you ain't right that running through the 6 stuff, then tell me who was Quentin really running through the 6 with? Because remember, Quentin again is from Atlanta. They're also known as the 6, Zone 6. Drake is from Toronto, also known as the 6. That's what I was saying earlier in this video. It's crazy to me that like Quentin Miller is writing these songs in a studio that Drake is paying for, knowing that they could potentially end up in Drake's lap, but Drake could reject them, and then Quentin ends up keeping them for himself. So you have bars in here that are so ambiguous, if that's the right word, like so vague, that they could encapsulate Quentin's life, but also encapsulate Drake's. Running through the 6. Obi's my brother, we go way back. These are bars that could both pertain to Quentin or Drake. To me, it was very disturbing. And along with that Meek Mill diss track that we got, Funk Flex also premiered the rest of the reference tracks that he had in his possession. This was like the big bang, or it was supposed to be at least, right? Meek Mill drops this diss track along with the reference tracks, and with that added ammo, that added shock value, that should be enough to completely destroy Drake. Well, it wasn't, and unfortunately, it really only ended up hurting a young kid from Atlanta who had just made his dreams come true by working with one of the biggest artists in the game. As for how the rest of these reference tracks leaked, not just 10 bands, you also had both Used To and Know Yourself from If You're Reading This Is Too Late, and the song Rico, the track that started this whole thing. And if you notice in the background of the Know Yourself reference track, if it stayed in this video, I don't know if it got copyrighted, but if not, you can hear someone in the background say, play it, you good? Play it again. And you might be asking yourself, how the hell did these reference tracks end up leaking out? Well, as Quentin explains it, the Know Yourself leak, that came from DJ Drama's camp too. Remember, Quentin at the time, as he's working on solo music with Drake, he's also working with his group, the Wedding Crashers, who are potentially exploring signing to DJ Drama and Don Cannon. So he's working heavily in Drama's studio. That's where he ends up playing Rico for Meek Mill and Nicki Minaj. And during another session, Drama has him play the song Know Yourself. Quentin says, we were in the studio one night with a bunch of people and Drama's like, yo man, play one of those joints. I'm like, nah man. He's like, play it, you're good, play it again. And if you listen to the Know Yourself reference, you can hear people in the background. It literally sounds like someone recorded it in the room. So you can see here, this was DJ Drama's role in the entire thing, right? With Quentin being, almost one of his artists, working very heavily with Drama, Drama was kind of carefree with how he was allowing Quentin to play these tracks around different people, exposing the whole thing to Meek Mill before Meek Mill took it to Twitter. So yeah, Meek Mill was the one to set it off, but it really was Drama who did not necessarily keep these things in the close protection that they probably needed to be. And Drake ended up explaining this in an interview years later, essentially stating that it was DJ Drama and John Cannon who really effed up Quentin's entire situation.
It's unfortunate, too, because Quentin was being managed by DJ Drama and Don Cannon, right, who ended up really fucking his shit up, because they were just, like, really messy with the shit. unnecessarily.
Of course, this is classic Drake not necessarily taking responsibility for the things he was at fault for in this situation, like completely ignoring Quentin after making him go online and basically lie to the whole world that he didn't actually write anything for Drake. And that backfired on Quentin. We'll explain that shortly. But in the meantime, we got to take an interesting detour in this story because Drake, in this 2017 interview, when he's explaining the whole situation, he also makes an interesting allusion to the fact that DJ Drama might have been pressured from some higher-ups to essentially give off those reference tracks to Funk Flex to premiere along with the Meek Mill track. This is where the rabbit hole gets really interesting, and let me try to simplify it for you guys. Again, Meek Mill is getting his butt handed to him, right? With Charged Up and Back to Back being this massive hit right off the rip. He needs something bigger and crazier to fire back at Drake because he just shot at the hip right away off of Twitter, making this bold claim that Drake didn't write his raps. Then Quentin, the ghostwriter in question, comes out and says that Drake does write his raps. Well, now he's got to back it up with some proof at the very least, right? And what better way to do that than to premiere along with your diss tracks all the reference tracks that show you weren't lying about someone else really writing Drake's bars. Drake says that he got those reference tracks because DJ Drama was pressured from a higher up saying, yo, we can't let our boy, aka Meek Mill, get his butt handed to him like this. We need something that's going to keep Drake down, that's going to make him lose this war and not make our guy, Meek Mill, look bad.
There were like these references from our sessions when we'd work together. No context to those references at all, but they existed. It was really DJ Drama that got a call from somebody higher up. At that time, you know, he didn't have the backbone to say no to this person. He was like, yo, my guy's getting roasted. You got to give him some ammo. We got to keep Drake down. And that was really when I realized like how deep this really is.
And like I said before, Quentin's story kind of aligned with this, right? Saying that, you know, Drama made him in the studio play all these reference tracks when a bunch of different people were in the room. That's likely how they ended up leaking. But who is this higher up guy that Drake is talking about who Drama couldn't say no to when the higher up guy was saying, yo, Meek Mill needs these reference tracks so we can keep Drake down and that Meek Mill can win this battle? Well, remember how I said we were going to revisit the lyrics of Charged Up? So let's do that. On the second verse, Drake raps, trust me, this information is vital. I'm trying to take the high road. I still got love for my idols. I got me a deal with Apple and I still feel entitled. Rumor has it there's something that only I know. When he says here, I still have love for my idols, I got me a deal with Apple and I still feel entitled, and then of course finishing that off saying there's something that only I know. Well, now we know that Drake ended up a couple months after this beef taking a $19 million contract with Apple to exclusively premiere his Views album on their streaming platform. But a couple months before this beef kicked off, Jay-Z had launched his own streaming platform, Tidal. So when Drake says, I got me a deal with Apple and I still feel entitled, it's a play on words on the word title. Drake was allegedly supposed to sign with Tidal because, again, if you guys don't remember, there was about 15 different artists, including Nicki Minaj, Kanye West, and more, who signed on as part owners of Tidal to make the platform a streaming network that worked in the artist's favor. Drake was supposed to sign, he never ended up doing so, and instead went to their rival, Apple Music. Now, at the same time, Meek Mill has been signed to Jay-Z under his management company at Roc Nation since 2012. Drake here is essentially saying, I still have love for my idols, like a Jay-Z who Drake has often referenced as being one of his greatest inspiration, and that he wants to take the high road, aka not bring Jay-Z involved in this thing. Right after that, referencing Apple Music and Tidal, which Drake rejected. A couple months later, on his 30 for 30 freestyle, Drake would rap, never thought I'd be talking from this perspective, but I'm not really sure what else you expected when the higher ups have all come together as a collective with conspiracies to end my run and send me a message. You would later see in April of 2016, about 6 months after the beef, Jay-Z would have 2 bars on a Drake song with Kanye West called Pop Style, but mysteriously when that song would appear on Drake's Views album, which again was an Apple Music exclusive premiere, both Jay-Z and Kanye's verses were mysteriously taken off the song. Kanye West would get on stage on tour and say that Jay-Z made both of them take off their verses because of the entire beef between Drake and Meek Mill.
I said, man, just go ahead and throw that on there. Y'all be so surprised, he probably wouldn't expect you to be on there. And we sent it back to him. And he's like, oh, shit, the throne is on this shit. Then Jay thought about it out of respect for Meek Mill, so he didn't want to be on the track. Then I said, look, I'll call Drake, I'll call Meek, I'll call y'all. We got to squash this shit. We got to let people have this song.
But then it went out of that territory, it went into some title, some political shit about percentages on songs. I can't take this shit, bro.
So it's very interesting how we see things play out, right? Jay-Z is removing himself off of Drake Records. Drake decides at the very last minute to not sign with Tidal, but instead sign with their rival, Apple Music. Meek Mill jumps out the gate exposing him for ghostwriters. Drake, in his first diss track, is talking about taking the high road with his idols, referencing Tidal. A couple months later, talking about the higher-ups trying to end his run and send him a message. And then years later, in an interview, saying that DJ Drama had to give up the reference tracks, the Quentin Miller reference tracks, because a higher-up had told him, yo, our guy is getting washed. We need something that is going to destroy Drake in this battle. Meek Mill had been signed under Jay-Z's Roc Nation management since 2012. We're now in 2015. And the night that he premieres his diss track, we also hear all of the Quentin Miller reference tracks. And Drake talking about higher-ups trying to send him a message with conspiracies to end his run. Who else could that higher-up be that pressured Drama to give up the reference tracks? A couple months later, we would get more clarity that it was DJ Drama who was in possession of the reference tracks and ended up leaking them. Like Quentin Miller had said, Drama pressured him to play these songs in the studio around a bunch of people, including Meek Mill. Like Drake had said, a higher up had pressured Drama to give up the reference tracks when Meek was dropping his diss track so that it can kind of combat the type of diss tracks that Drake was dropping. And now, in November of 2015, we get tweets from Summer P. Walker. You guys probably know her now as Summer Walker, the R&B singer. But she was actually dating, at one point, Drake, and at one point DJ Drama as well. Drake has bars about her. On The Plug, he rapped, I got Summer P in this thing. And way back in 2013, he had a song called From Time where he rapped, I got Summer a Michael Kors. Then she started telling me how I'll never be as big as Trey Songz. Boy, was she wrong. And in 2016, in that summer, he would rap on the DJ Khaled song For Free. Last year, I had Drama Girl, Not Right Now. This was Drama's girl. DJ Drama's girl. Last year, he not only had Drama with Meek Mill, but he also had Drama's girl, Summer P. Walker. And then he referenced her in September on a song called I'm the Plug. I got Summer P in this thing. And she tweets out in November of 2015 saying, you told me you gave Meek Mill Drake's reference tracks to make him feel bad about Quentin not wanting to work for him. DJ Drama. And this aligns with Quentin's story of how Drama brought Meek and Nicki to the studio and asked 3 times for Quentin to write for Meek. You see how all these dots are kind of connecting, right? Drake meets a kid from Atlanta through Boy Wonder, has him work for him on a bunch of different songs. At the same time, this artist is also working with DJ Drama. Drama gets in the studio with Meek Mill, has Quentin Miller play the reference tracks for Meek so that he knows Drake wasn't taking shots at him with the bar, the girl of your dreams is not a challenge. But then Meek Mill ends up fighting with Nicki Minaj and gets on Twitter to air out the fact that he heard these Drake reference tracks. One of which Quentin Miller had played to some friends, thinking that Drake would just hop on as a feature and this was really Quentin's song. But the others, Drama had been in the studio asking Quentin to play, and someone recorded them. And at least according to Drake, Jay-Z, who was managing Meek Mill, or as Drake puts it, a higher up in the industry, had pressured DJ Drama to essentially give Meek Mill these reference tracks to leak along with his diss track so that that could really put a chink in Drake's armor. And then Drama and Drake's old girl, Summer P. Walker, had given us the confirmation on Twitter to put the final puzzle piece together on this entire debacle. You could say it's just a bunch of rumors, but from all 3 angles, Drake, DJ Drama, and Quentin Miller, their stories all pretty much align here. And they also align with everything that Akademiks heard, everything that Dream Chaser artist had said, and everything that Summer Walker had said. So now we got the beef out of the way. Meek Mill looks like a complete idiot after back-to-back, right? Didn't handle that well at all. And one question that remains unanswered that we're going to touch on right now is the fact that right after Meek had announced Quentin was writing Drake's songs, Quentin gets online and says, nah, you got it all wrong. Drake had, if you're reading this is too late, already finished. I saw him actually go in and write songs like Madonna and 6 p.m. in New York himself. I wasn't even really needed there. I don't know what he was doing with me. He just believed in me, right? He's saying that makes Meek look bad. It kind of invalidates his claims that Drake needs a ghostwriter, right? So Meek Mill is obviously not happy about this entire thing. It played out horribly for him after back-to-back, so he couldn't really fight back at Drake at this point, right? Drake had already beat him from a battle rap perspective, but there was one person who Meek Mill had not fully resolved his issues with, and that was Quentin Miller. And this is when things kind of get bad for Quentin, right? Like, already you kind of ruined your chances at being, a secret writer in the industry, because now there's this stigma behind you that if people work with you, their reference tracks might get leaked. And you're going to have harder times trying to be an artist on your own because you're standing in the shadow of not just this beef, but also the pen behind some of Drake's most transformative hits. The hits that really turned him from the soft, simping sad boy to the phony Montana mob boss. And you continuously rejected working for Meek Mill and even disvalued his claims that Drake had a writer, right? So a couple months after this beef kind of died down, Quentin Miller is at a Nike store. And when he gets there, he sees Meek Mill. So I'll let Quentin kind of tell the story. I'll quote it through him. That Nike store situation was crazy. That day, I was about to go to Hit Boy's house. But before that, I decided to stop at the Nike store. I was in a wheelchair at the time. I got out of the Uber, and across the street, there's a bunch of paparazzi. I'm thinking, oh crap, who is this? Then me and Meek Mill lock eyes. I'm like, of course. I just turn and go into the store. As I'm turning in, I see someone from his crew waving, like, yo, yo. I keep going. They come into the store. Meek is like, yo, man, what's up? He says, you're making me look crazy. And I'm like, bro. Then he goes, yo, I can tell you're not on that street stuff, so I'm not going to do anything. One of his guys goes, get on camera and say you were lying. Say that you really did write those Drake songs. Because you got to think at the time, right? Like, yeah, the reference tracks from Quentin Miller had leaked, but Drake just gave us 2 crazy diss songs. From an outside looking in, you could think that those reference tracks were complete cap. Like, that was just someone rapping over Drake's songs. Quentin's getting online and saying that he wasn't Drake's ghostwriter. You're getting these random songs and you don't know where the actual reference tracks are coming from. So you could think, again, they're complete BS. So Meek Mill is telling Quentin, like, you're making me look crazy. I need you on camera right now saying that you really were the one behind those songs. Quentin says no. Meek says you're not on any street stuff, so I'm going to go away. Then Quentin says, then one of his guys come back in with a camera to the Nike store. I later heard, but I can't confirm, that it was a Nicki Minaj call. If that's true, that means Nicki told them to run it back with the camera. Understand, Meek had just decided not to do anything after quote-unquote evaluating my street cred. But supposedly, they went back into the car and Nicki said, nah, run that. Listen, I'm a Nicki fan, always have been. My daughter's a Nicki fan. I'm the president of the Barbs. But that stuff was effed up. I don't know for a fact that it was Nicki, and I don't want to put that on her if it's not true. But Drama once said, Nicki did something wrong. And he wasn't there either. So I don't know what he was talking about. I hope that wasn't the case. So Meek's guy came back into the store with the camera, and that's when his homeboy swung on me. Then I left the Nike store. I went straight to Hit Boy's studio, thinking it was going to be a regular day. I'm there telling them the story, and then Travis Scott pulls up. Now I'm standing there with a busted lip. Like, come on, man. This is what y'all did to me? I'm just trying to make my name out here. So sadly, no pun intended, Quentin Miller is getting beaten up by the industry. Not just literally by Meek Mill for not corroborating his story that Drake was using him as a ghostwriter, but by the industry as a whole. Because for the next few months, it was very hard for Quentin to kind of find his way as a real solo artist. Before this, he had his motion not just behind the scenes writing for Drake, but also with the potential that him and Mac could form something big with Wedding Crashers and potentially signing to DJ Drama. But now, Drama wants nothing to do with him, Drake wants nothing to do with him, the whole world views him as this mysterious ghostwriter. It's very hard to get your footing in after that. And as Quentin describes it, aside from putting out some music of his own in that era,
Yikes! Spending money over spending time. Trail Atlanta, bandanas on containers. Say that's right, that's right.
Definitely some promising stuff, but he was also living out his party days. Like I mentioned earlier in this video, Quentin was homeschooled, so at this point, he's like kind of famous in the industry, definitely working heavily within the music industry, right? So he's living out his party days as he's trying to become this famous rapper. He's popping Xanax, doing drugs, and he realizes you can't just get off Xanax by quitting cold turkey. You have to weave yourself off of it. So he's in the process of doing that, but as he is, there's one day where I guess he had taken either a bad pill or just maybe a little bit too much, and he's driving in his car, and as he puts it, he believes he unfortunately suffered a seizure. Throughout that seizure, he ends up crashing his car, and the blow was so massive, they ended up having to amputate his leg. It took months for Quentin to fight off this injury and get back up walking, but he ended up doing so, and to this day, he still has a prosthetic leg. He fought off the injury, but remember now, we're like months and months into 2016. The beef had subsided, but Quentin had to take months off of actually building his career as he spends the time focusing on his health and recovering from this injury. So making a return to music after months of taking a hiatus to get yourself back on your feet, in the literal sense, but also in the figurative sense, because now we're over a year removed from the Drake and Meek Mill beef. And anytime Quentin's name is brought up or he releases a new track, it's always tied back to that massive stain on Drake's reputation. The fact that he was the first one in hip-hop to ever be exposed for using word for word another artist's reference track. And it's hard to make it when you're casted in such a big shadow like that. It's not just that you are behind one of the biggest artists in the game, it's that you are behind the big reveal that the biggest artist in the game was using your music and claiming it as his own. And Quentin has some dope tracks. To this day, he's still putting out music consistently.
I don't know, somebody lied.
He's still trying to get his name out there, still pursuing his dreams. So I highly suggest you guys check out more of his music. But it's sad because as far as this entire situation plays out, even how DJ Drama puts it, Quentin was the only one who really suffered. Drake went on to have a prosperous career. As with Meek Mill, DJ Drama ended up taking his record labels to crazier heights than he ever could have imagined when he was first working with Quentin, potentially debating on signing him, as he's now fully developed both Jack Harlow and Lil Uzi into full-fledged superstars. And DJ Drama and Drake had reconciled their differences at a music video shoot for a Jack Harlow song. And of course, Drake and Meek Mill had squashed their differences, collaborating on a track, and Drake bringing Meek out to perform at various shows. The only one who lost contact with Drake, contact with Drama, barely made any money off the songs he did with Drake, and struggled to make a name for himself within the industry after this entire incident was Quentin Miller. Looking back, he's really the only one who suffered from this entire situation. Even Drake and Nicki Minaj are cool to this day. And Quentin had reflected on it, saying, when If You're Reading This Is Too Late dropped, I remember calling my dad like, dang, I told you I was going to do something to touch this world. It was an opportunity for me, man. It felt huge. But then, the best dream of my life turned into a scary nightmare. Suddenly, I had to hold the pieces together. It felt like when I got dropped from my label for the first time from Tricky in the Dream. Like, damn, I have to figure this stuff out all over again. And then in 2016, I lost my leg. Now I had 2 mountains to climb. That year was almost entirely about trying to walk again. I'd have little momentum to my name, and if I was going to do something with it, it needed to be then, right as my name got called out in this massive Drake and Meek Mill beef. But I'm sitting in bed just trying to walk again, so the timing was incredibly inconvenient. I never wanted to be just a writer though. It's an interesting sport. I think I have more passion for creating based on what I feel, especially now. When certain people want certain types of songs, not everybody is that type of songwriter. In terms of the feeling of being a writer, you're basically the help. You're replaceable. You come in when it's time to work, and when it's time to celebrate, you're forgotten. Everybody gets paid except for you, and your publishing check might not come for a year or more, depending on your situation. It's a thankless job. Hours and hours of work, and no pay until much later. I do think it's important for us as black men to have those conversations where we set egos aside, acknowledge if something was done wrong, and move forward. Drake patched things up with others involved. Why not me? There's room for a conversation. Enough splitting, beefing, and breaking apart, more accountability, and moving forward. I'm not against it at all. I did have expectations with Drake and DJ Drama. I had relationships with those dudes. I worked with them. That's why the whole thing felt so strange. I thought after that whole situation, the phone was about to ring off the hook. Anytime you're involved with even one song with this guy, it's supposed to change your life. That's what I thought, but it just wasn't like that. It didn't happen. And I think out of everyone that has done an interview with Quentin Miller since this whole situation has ensued, it was actually DJ Vlad who had kind of the best point to summarize the entire situation. I can't play you the clip because DJ Vlad loves to copyright strike, but when he sat down with Quentin Miller, Quentin again expressed how disheartening it was that after all these years, every person involved has reconciled with each other. Drake is cool with Drama, Meek, and Nicki Minaj, but meanwhile, the one person who was the most loyal to him gets kicked to the side, forced to live in the shadow of this Drake album, and now has to clarify every single time he works with another artist because the industry is afraid that it'll be a bad look to collaborate with him, that it'll look like he's your ghostwriter. There's this stigma around him now writing other big rappers' records. And Vlad emphasized that it doesn't matter how good you were to these people within the industry. It doesn't matter that you were loyal to Drake, Doesn't matter that you were, playing these records for drama when he was begging you to, and you were always loyal to him as well. It's all about power. No one's loyal in this game. And when your music is too big or your impact is too powerful to ignore, that's when you'll start seeing the same people who now talk about you like you're a has-been, like you got kicked to the curb, like they feel sorry for you. When you're too powerful to ignore, that's when they'll start coming around. They don't care that Quentin was basically blackballed, beaten up in the Nike store, used as this pawn within this beef between two of hip-hop's titans. But they will care if he comes back with a, if you're reading this is too late, of his own. But let me know what you guys think, and I will catch you in the next one.